never thought the aroma of slow-smoked ribs would trigger a neighborhood war, but here I was, standing in my backyard, facing a scowling woman who was already punching numbers into her phone. "This is your final warning," she declared, with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed this moment. "Your barbecue smoke is a violation of HOA regulations, and I'm calling the authorities right now." If you're watching this and thinking, "Not another HOA nightmare story," trust me, this one takes a delicious turn you won't see coming. Drop a comment below letting me know where you're watching from. I'd love to know if HOA drama is as universal as I suspect. As she dramatically pressed her phone to her ear, I couldn't help but smile. Little did she know her power trip was about to backfire in the most spectacular way, and my slow-cooked ribs would become legendary for reasons neither of us could have anticipated. The confrontation that began with a neighborly cookout would eventually expose years of corruption, unite an entire community, and even bring the local police department to my dinner table. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, to the innocent purchase of a dream home that came with a nightmare neighbor I never expected. When my wife Rachel and I purchased our dream home in Oak Ridge Estates 3 months ago, the real estate agent mentioned something about a homeowners association, but glossed over the details during our excited discussions about school districts and mortgage rates. "It's pretty standard stuff," he assured us, while highlighting the community pool and well-maintained parks. "Just some basic rules to keep property values up." Those basic rules turned out to be a 47-page handbook that arrived in our mailbox the day after we moved in, delivered personally by none other than Diane Wheeler, HOA board president and self-admitted neighborhood watchdog. I should have recognized the warning signs when she introduced herself with a tight smile that never reached her eyes, handing over the handbook with the gravity of someone delivering sacred texts. "I trust you'll familiarize yourself with our community standards," she said, eyeing our moving boxes as if searching for violations. "We take pride in maintaining the character of our neighborhood." I nodded politely, set the handbook aside, and continued unpacking, completely unaware that I had just met the woman who would soon attempt to dismantle my weekend hobby and inadvertently set in motion the most entertaining neighborhood saga since Mrs. Jenkins' wayward pet peacock incident of 2018, but that's another story entirely. Rachel had whispered to me after Diane left, "That woman seems intense," but we were too busy organizing our new life to give much thought to community politics. If only we'd paid more attention to that handbook right away, we might have avoided what was coming. Or maybe it was inevitable from the moment we chose a house with a perfect backyard for entertaining. Cooking has always been my passion, particularly slow-smoking meats to perfection. Back in our apartment, I'd made do with a small electric smoker on the balcony, dreaming of the day I could upgrade to a proper setup. Within a week of moving into our new home, I'd invested in a beautiful offset smoker, nothing industrial or oversized, just a well-made residential model that could handle enough meat for family gatherings. The first few weekends passed in blissful experimentation as I adjusted to the new equipment, perfecting my brisket technique and developing a dry rub for ribs that had Rachel declaring it was worth every penny of our mortgage just for the food. Neighbors would occasionally stop by when walking past, drawn by the aromas wafting over our fence, and I'd happily offer samples and conversation. It seemed like an ideal way to integrate into our new community, until Diane caught wind of it, quite literally. My first real encounter with Diane's regulatory fervor came during our housewarming party. We had invited a few new neighbors and some old friends, nothing extravagant, just some drinks, music at a reasonable volume, and of course my signature smoked brisket and ribs on the backyard smoker. The weather was perfect that day, one of those golden late spring afternoons where the temperature hovers around 75 degrees, and there's just enough breeze to keep everyone comfortable. Rachel had spent the morning decorating our patio with string lights and potted plants, transforming the still bare backyard into a welcoming space. Several neighbors had accepted our invitation with genuine enthusiasm, telling us they were excited to meet the new family on the block. I'd started the smoker early that morning, carefully monitoring the temperature and adding wood chips at precise intervals to achieve that perfect smoky flavor that had become my trademark among friends. Around 7 p.m., as guests were mingling and the meat was developing that perfect bark, the doorbell rang with an insistent, repeated pressure that suggested whoever was pressing it wasn't feeling particularly patient. I opened the door to find Diane, arms crossed, a neighbor I hadn't met standing uncomfortably behind her. "Mr. Mitchell," she began without preamble, "we've received complaints about smoke from your property. You need to extinguish your cooking fire immediately." I blinked in surprise, glancing back at my perfectly standard smoker, which was emitting only the thinnest wisp of fragrant hickory smoke. "There's no actual fire," I explained. "It's just a smoker for the barbecue. It's completely contained and safe." Diane's expression didn't change. Section 12, paragraph B clearly states that no activity may produce odors detectable from neighboring properties. Several residents have complained about the smell. The neighbor behind her, whose name I later learned was Tom, looked apologetic and mouthed, "Not me," when Diane turned slightly to gesture at the street. I took a deep breath, maintained my composure, and promised to review the regulations later, but explained that I couldn't exactly stop in the middle of cooking for our guests. Diane's eyes narrowed. "Consider this a verbal warning. Next time there will be fines." With that, she pivoted and marched away, leaving poor Tom to offer an awkward wave before hurrying after her. As I closed the door, Rachel appeared by my side. "What was that about?" she asked. I recounted the conversation, watching her expression shift from confusion to indignation. "That's ridiculous," she said finally. "Who complains about the smell of barbecue? That's like complaining about the smell of fresh bread or cookies." I agreed, but a seed of worry had been planted. We'd invested everything in this house, and the last thing we needed was ongoing conflict with the neighborhood authority. After that initial confrontation, I did actually read through the entire HOA handbook, paying special attention to the sections about outdoor activities and nuisances. What I discovered was interesting. The rule about odors was buried deep in the document and worded vaguely enough that it could technically apply to everything from barbecues to garden flowers. However, I also noticed there was nothing specific about outdoor cooking equipment, and more importantly, the handbook included a section about community gatherings and neighborly activities being encouraged. Armed with this knowledge, I continued my weekend barbecue tradition, though I did make a few adjustments. Moving the smoker to the far corner of the yard, away from the property line I shared with what I'd now identified as Diane's house 2 doors down, and investing in a smoke diverter. For a few weekends, life was peaceful. I even invited some of the neighbors who had expressed interest in my cooking, building small but meaningful connections in our new community. Tom, the neighbor who had been dragged along on Diane's first visit, became a regular, bringing excellent craft beers and admitting that he'd been something of a Diane hostage for years. "She runs the HOA like it's her personal fiefdom," he confided one evening as we watched the sunset from my patio, plates of pulled pork in hand. "Most people just try to fly under her radar, but she really seems to have it out for you. Probably because you didn't immediately fold when she gave you that first warning." I asked him how she had become so powerful in the neighborhood. Tom took a long pull of his beer before answering. She moved in about 5 years ago, joined the board immediately, and within 6 months had maneuvered her way to president. The previous president wanted to step down anyway. It's basically a thankless job, and Diane was the only one who actually wanted it. Once she had the position, she started interpreting the rules more strictly and adding new ones during the annual review. By the time people realized what was happening, she had enough supporters, or at least people afraid to oppose her, to maintain her position. I considered this information carefully. "So what you're saying is, no one's really tried to challenge her authority?" Tom chuckled without humor. "Oh, people have tried. The Hendersons over on Maple Drive wanted to paint their house a slightly different shade of beige than the approved palette. They fought it for months, spent hundreds on appeals, and eventually gave up and painted it the acceptable color. The Gabriels tried to add a small fountain to their front garden. Diane shut it down as a water feature requiring board approval. After a while, people just stopped trying. This insight into the neighborhood dynamics was valuable but also troubling. I hadn't moved my family here to fight political battles. I just wanted to enjoy my home and my hobbies. But something about Diane's arbitrary exercise of power rubbed me the wrong way. I wasn't looking for a fight, but I wasn't going to be bullied either. The relative peace lasted exactly 4 weekends before the escalation I had subconsciously been expecting. It was a beautiful Saturday afternoon in June, and I had a few neighbors and colleagues over for what had become a casual tradition. The smoker was doing its thing in the yard corner, less visible but still producing mouth-watering aromas. I'd invited some colleagues from work this time, and 2 had brought their families, adding children's laughter to the mix of pleasant background sounds. Everyone seemed to be enjoying themselves, especially the kids who had discovered our sprinkler system and were taking full advantage with parental permission. Rachel had prepared her famous mac and cheese as a side dish which had already received multiple requests for the recipe. I was explaining the difference between Texas and Kansas City barbecue styles to an enraptured audience when a sharp, official-sounding knock interrupted us. "I'll get it," Rachel called from inside, but something about the authoritative nature of the knock made me excuse myself to join her. Opening our front door, we found ourselves face to face with 2 police officers, and behind them, standing at the edge of my driveway with an expression of vindicated triumph, was Diane. My heart sank even as I maintained a calm exterior. Rachel instinctively reached for my hand, a gesture that wasn't lost on the officers. "Officers," I greeted them, genuinely confused. "What can I help you with?" The taller officer, whose nameplate read Robertson, glanced at his notepad. "We received a complaint about a fire hazard and possible illegal burning at this address." I couldn't help it. I laughed, then, seeing their serious expressions, quickly composed myself. "I'm sorry, officers. There's no fire hazard. I'm just smoking some meat in the backyard. Would you like to see?" I led them through the house to the backyard, where my well-maintained smoker sat contentedly puffing small amounts of smoke, surrounded by appreciative guests who looked up in surprise at the police presence. Officer Robertson took one look at the setup, then turned to his partner with a barely concealed sigh. The second officer, Davis according to his nameplate, actually sniffed the air appreciatively. "Sir," Robertson said, "this is clearly not a fire hazard or illegal burning situation. Your equipment appears to be in proper order." He paused, then added more quietly, "We get these calls sometimes. HOA disputes." I nodded my understanding. "I appreciate you checking it out. Would either of you like to try some brisket while you're here? It's just about ready." Officer Davis looked momentarily tempted before Robertson gave him a subtle head shake. "We're on duty, but thank you for the offer," Robertson said professionally. "Just keep the smoke levels reasonable and you shouldn't have any issues." As I escorted them back through the house, I noticed my guests watching with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Rachel had engaged Diane in conversation near the patrol car, apparently trying to diffuse the situation with neighborly chat. From Diane's rigid posture, it wasn't going well. The officers apologized for the disturbance and were preparing to leave when inspiration struck me. "Officers, since you've had to come all this way, would you like to take some food with you? It'll be ready in about 30 minutes. Officer Davis looked tempted, but Robertson maintained his professional demeanor. "That's not necessary, sir, but we appreciate the offer." As they walked back through the house, I noticed Diane still standing in my driveway, waiting for the outcome. When the officers emerged without taking any action against me, her expression darkened. Officer Robertson spoke briefly to her, and though I couldn't hear the words, the firm set of his shoulders suggested he was explaining that no violations had occurred. As Diane gesticulated toward my house, I heard snippets of persistent nuisance and property values. Eventually, the officers nodded politely, returned to their patrol car, and drove away. Diane remained for a moment, staring at my house with an intensity that would have withered less resilient vegetation, before turning sharply and walking away. That evening, after my guests had departed with full stomachs and stories to tell, I found an official-looking notice taped to my mailbox. violation of community standards, unauthorized cooking equipment visible from street, fine, $150. HOA board meeting to address continued violations, Tuesday, 7 p.m., Community Center. The notice was signed with Diane's precise angular signature, complete with her title as board president. I pulled it down, brought it inside, and added it to what I was now calling my Diane file. This wasn't just about barbecue anymore. This was about standing up to petty tyranny. Rachel examined the notice with concern. "Do we have to pay this? It seems completely unreasonable." I shook my head. "Not yet. First, I want to understand exactly what rules are actually being enforced here, and I have a feeling Diane might be overstepping." That night, I stayed up late researching HOA law and residents' rights in our state, making notes and formulating a plan. This wasn't the battle I'd expected when we bought our dream home, but somehow, I was beginning to feel like it was one worth fighting. Over the next few days, I noticed something disturbing. Neighbors who had been friendly were suddenly distant, offering quick waves instead of stopping to chat. When I finally cornered Tom during his evening dog walk, he reluctantly explained the situation. "Diane's been talking to everyone, saying you're uncooperative and threatening to sue the HOA. She's claiming your cooking is decreasing property values and that you verbally abused her." I was stunned. None of that is true. I've been nothing but polite even when she called the police on a perfectly normal barbecue. Tom looked around nervously, lowering his voice. "I know that, and a few others do too, but Diane has been running things here for 5 years. People are afraid to cross her. She once got someone's renovation project halted halfway through over an unapproved shade of exterior paint. They had to leave the house half-finished for 3 months during appeals." This information made my blood boil, but it also crystallized my resolve. "The HOA meeting on Tuesday," I said. "Will you be there?" Tom nodded hesitantly. "I'll be there, but I don't know how much support you'll get publicly. Diane has ways of making life difficult for people who oppose her." I thanked him for the heads up and spent the evening researching HOA regulations, state laws governing homeowners associations, and, most importantly, the specific bylaws of our Oak Ridge Estates HOA. What I discovered gave me a slow-building sense of confidence. Like many who wield power arbitrarily, Diane had been counting on residents' ignorance of the actual rules and their rights. Tuesday's meeting was going to be interesting, to say the least. Rachel was concerned about my growing obsession with the situation. "James, maybe we should just pay the fine and be more careful about when we barbecue," she suggested one evening. "Is this really worth all this energy?" I looked up from my laptop where I'd been studying the HOA's financial disclosure requirements. "It's not just about the barbecue anymore," I explained. "It's about living in a community where one person doesn't get to interpret rules however they want for their own power. If we give in on this, what's next? We can't paint our door the color we want? We can't plant the garden we've been planning? Where does it end?" Rachel still seemed doubtful, but she nodded. "Okay, but promise me you'll keep it civil and professional. We have to live here for the long haul, remember?" I promised, though I couldn't help wondering if Diane operated by the same principles. The community center was surprisingly full when I arrived for the HOA meeting on Tuesday evening. I recognized most of the faces, though many avoided eye contact as I took a seat near the back. Diane sat at the center of a folding table at the front, flanked by 4 other board members who looked significantly less comfortable than their president. The meeting progressed through standard business, discussions of the community garden, an upcoming repaving project, and a reminder about the annual 4th of July celebration. Finally, Diane reached the violations and enforcement section of the agenda. "Now, we need to address the ongoing situation at 347 Oak Ridge Lane," she announced, looking directly at me. "Mr. Mitchell has been operating cooking equipment that violates our community standards regarding odors and aesthetics. Despite verbal warnings and a formal notice, the violations have continued. The board recommends an escalating fine structure and possible lien action if compliance is not achieved within 30 days. She looked around the room with an expression that invited agreement but not discussion. That was when I stood up. "I'd like to address these accusations, if I may." Diane's smile tightened. "The violation notice has an appeals process, Mr. Mitchell. This meeting is simply to inform the community of the board's decision." I smiled pleasantly. "Actually, according to Bylaw 7, Section 3, any homeowner has the right to address the full meeting regarding enforcement actions before they're finalized. I'm exercising that right now." A murmur ran through the room, and I noticed one of the board members leaning over to whisper something to Diane, who looked momentarily flustered before regaining her composure. "Very well. You have 3 minutes." I could feel Rachel's supportive presence beside me, though I knew she was nervous about what might unfold. I gave her hand a reassuring squeeze before making my way to the front of the room, bringing my folder of research with me. "Thank you," I began, moving to the front of the room. "First, I'd like to clarify that my smoker is a standard residential model, fully compliant with county fire codes, as verified by Officers Robertson and Davis when they responded to a complaint last weekend and found no violations. Second, regarding the odor regulation, I've reviewed our bylaws thoroughly and found that the specific rule states that no noxious or offensive activity shall be carried out on any lot, nor shall anything be done thereon which may become an annoyance or nuisance to the neighborhood. I would argue that the occasional aroma of barbecue does not constitute a noxious or offensive activity by any reasonable standard. In fact," I continued, pulling out a folder from my bag, "I've collected statements from 12 neighbors who find the smell enjoyable and consider my weekend barbecues to be a positive contribution to the neighborhood atmosphere." I handed the papers to the nearest board member, who accepted them with wide eyes. "Finally, regarding visibility from the street, Section 14 of our bylaws specifically exempts temporary recreational equipment under which my weekend smoker would reasonably fall. I bring it out for use and store it in my garage when not in use." The room had gone completely silent. I could feel every eye on me, including Diane's increasingly frosty glare. "In light of these facts, I request that the violation notice be rescinded and that any future concerns be addressed through proper channels, specifically a direct conversation with me before escalation to fines or law enforcement." I smiled at the board. "I'm always happy to discuss reasonable accommodations with my neighbors. In fact, next weekend, I'll be hosting a community barbecue fundraiser for the local children's hospital. Everyone is welcome, including our local police department, who have expressed interest in attending." This last part wasn't exactly true yet, but I had a plan. "Thank you for your time." I returned to my seat amid a buzz of whispered conversation. Rachel looked at me with a mixture of pride and concern. "That was either brilliant or we're going to be social pariahs," she whispered. "The police department part was a nice touch, but can you deliver?" I winked at her. "Just watch me." The remainder of the meeting was anticlimactic. Diane, clearly thrown off balance but unwilling to back down entirely, suggested tabling the matter for further review of the bylaws, effectively postponing any decision. As people filed out afterwards, several neighbors approached me with newfound respect, a few even apologizing for believing the rumors. Tom clapped me on the shoulder. "That was impressive." I've never seen Diane speechless before. I grinned. "The fight's not over yet, she's just regrouping." True to my word, the next morning I called the police department's non-emergency line and asked to speak with Officers Robertson and Davis. When Officer Robertson came on the line, I explained my plan for a community fundraiser barbecue to benefit the children's hospital. We'd be honored if some officers could attend. It might help ease tensions in the neighborhood, and it's for a good cause. There was a pause, then Robertson replied, "That's an interesting approach, Mr. Mitchell. Let me discuss it with a sergeant and get back to you." By that afternoon, I had confirmation. Not only would Robertson and Davis attend, but the sergeant was interested as well, especially after hearing about the previous unnecessary call-out. The police department even offered to help promote the fundraiser through their community outreach program. I spent the next few days distributing flyers throughout the neighborhood, being careful to emphasize the charitable nature of the event and the official police department endorsement. I made sure a flyer was prominently delivered to Diane's mailbox, accompanied by a handwritten note inviting her to attend and work together to build community spirit. It was both a sincere gesture and a strategic move. She could hardly continue to paint me as the neighborhood villain if I was hosting a charity event supported by law enforcement. Rachel was fully on board now, impressed by how I'd turned the conflict into something positive. "You know," she said as we prepared donation boxes for the event, "I'm starting to think this whole Diane situation might be the best thing that could have happened to us here. Look how many neighbors we've already met." I had to agree. What had begun as a defense of my barbecue rights was evolving into something much more meaningful, a genuine effort to build community in a place that had been ruled by fear for too long. The day of the barbecue fundraiser dawned bright and clear, as if the weather itself was endorsing my plan. I had been up since 5 a.m. preparing the smokers. I'd borrowed 2 additional ones from friends to handle the anticipated crowd, and setting up tables and canopies in my backyard and driveway. The menu had been meticulously planned. My signature ribs, of course, but also pulled pork, smoked chicken, and even a vegetarian option of smoked portobello mushrooms and grilled vegetable skewers. I wanted to ensure everyone felt welcome, regardless of dietary preferences. I'd spent the previous evening preparing my special dry rubs and sauces, each labeled with handwritten tags that Rachel had designed with our newly purchased label maker. A small investment in professionalism that seemed appropriate given the event's charitable nature. Rachel had prepared side dishes and desserts, transforming our kitchen into a production line of coleslaw, potato salad, and her famous brownies. She'd even reached out to the local bakery, which had generously donated rolls and cornbread muffins once they heard about the fundraiser. By 9 a.m., the aromas had begun to permeate the neighborhood, and I noticed several curious faces peering over fences or slowing their walking pace as they passed our house. A few even called out encouragement. "Smells amazing, James," which boosted my confidence that the event would be well attended. By noon, the aroma of smoking meat had fully enveloped the neighborhood, and neighbors began to arrive, many bringing side dishes, drinks, or donations for the children's hospital. Tom and his wife were among the first to arrive, helping with last-minute preparations and introducing me to neighbors I hadn't yet met. Betty from 2 streets over brought homemade lemonade in enormous glass dispensers, while the Johnsons from the corner house set up a face-painting station for the kids who would be coming. The elderly couple from the corner house brought homemade pickles and told me they'd lived in the neighborhood for 30 years and had never seen it so divided as in recent years. "This is like the old days," Mr. Lewis said approvingly, gesturing at the gathering crowd. "Neighbors actually talking to each other instead of just sending violation notices." His wife nodded in agreement, adding, "We used to have block parties every summer before all these rules took over. It's nice to see someone bringing back the tradition." The atmosphere was relaxed and festive, with children playing in supervised groups and adults mingling freely, many meeting properly for the first time despite living doors away from each other. The police officers arrived around 1, not just Robertson and Davis, but 5 others including Sergeant Miller, all in casual clothes but unmistakably a unit. Miller approached me with a firm handshake. "Great turnout, Mitchell," as the department kicked in a donation as well. He handed me an envelope containing a check for the Children's Hospital. "We appreciate citizens who find positive ways to resolve neighborhood issues." The presence of the officers changed the dynamic significantly. Neighbors who might have been hesitant to openly support me against Diane's wishes now had the perfect excuse. They were supporting the police and a children's charity after all. By 2 o'clock, my property was filled with people enjoying food, conversation, and the perfect summer afternoon. Children played in supervised groups, adults mingled and discussed everything but HOA regulations, and even a local reporter showed up, alerted by the police department's community outreach coordinator about the fundraiser. Everything was going perfectly, which is exactly when Diane decided to make her entrance. I spotted her before she saw me, standing at the edge of my driveway, arms crossed, taking in the scene with an expression that couldn't seem to decide between outrage and disbelief. She wore what I'd come to think of as her official HOA president outfit: press slacks, a blazer despite the heat, and a blouse buttoned to the throat. Her hair was pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, and she carried a small leather portfolio that I suspected contained printouts of HOA regulations relevant to my supposed infractions. For a moment she simply stood there, surveying the festivities with an increasingly pinched expression as she noted the police presence, the reporter, and the overall atmosphere of community enjoyment that seemed to physically pain her. Several neighbors noticed her arrival, their expressions ranging from concern to curiosity as they watched to see how the situation would unfold. I caught Rachel's eye across the yard, and she gave me a small, encouraging nod. Taking a deep breath, I excused myself from a conversation with Officer Davis about smoking techniques and approached her with my most genuine smile. "Diane, I'm so glad you could make it. Can I fix you a plate?" For a moment she seemed thrown by the friendly welcome. Then her eyes narrowed. "What exactly do you think you're doing, Mitchell? This gathering exceeds the permissible number of guests without prior board approval. The vehicles parked along the street are a violation of Section 9. And the noise level—" I interrupted gently. "It's a community charity event, Diane, for sick children, with the police department's full support." I gestured toward Sergeant Miller, who was watching our interaction with interest. "Why don't you join us? We've raised over $2,000 already." Diane's gaze flicked to the uniformed officers, then back to me. I could almost see the calculations running behind her eyes. "This doesn't change anything," she said finally, her voice lowered. "You're deliberately undermining my authority in this community." And there it was, the real issue laid bare, not smoke or visibility or property values, but control. I kept my voice equally low, but remained pleasant. "This isn't about you or me, Diane. It's about what kind of community we want to live in. One ruled by fear and strict enforcement, or one where neighbors support each other and find reasonable compromises. I've done my homework. There's nothing in the bylaws prohibiting charity events, especially when they're supported by local law enforcement." I watched as her jaw tightened, her fingers gripping the leather portfolio so tightly that her knuckles whitened. For a brief moment, I almost felt sorry for her. It couldn't be easy watching your carefully constructed power structure begin to crumble. But before she could formulate a response, a new voice joined our conversation. "Mrs. Wheeler, I'm Lindsay Chen from the County Gazette. I'd love to get a quote from the HOA president about this wonderful community initiative." I watched as Diane's face went through a remarkable transformation, her features softening into something approximating warmth, though the effect didn't quite reach her eyes. She gave me one last sharp look before turning to the reporter with professional poise. I left them to their interview, returning to my hosting duties with a mixture of amusement and genuine hope that Diane might see the value in what was happening here beyond the challenge to her authority. The expression that crossed Diane's face was priceless, a mixture of trapped calculation and sudden forced pleasantness. "Of course," she managed, turning to the reporter with a smile that looked physically painful. "Our association fully supports community-minded events like this one." As Lindsay began asking questions about the HOA's involvement in community building, I excused myself to check on the food, shooting a sympathetic glance at Sergeant Miller, who had moved closer to monitor the situation. He gave me a subtle nod that conveyed both amusement and approval. For the remainder of the afternoon, Diane maintained a strained presence at the periphery of the gathering, unable to leave without appearing unsupportive of a charity event in front of a reporter, but clearly seething beneath her forced smile. The fundraiser continued successfully, with Officer Davis declaring my ribs the best he'd ever tasted, loudly enough for several nearby conversations to pause appreciatively. By the time people began to disperse in the early evening, we had raised nearly $3,000 for the Children's Hospital. I had solidified positive relationships with at least 20 neighbors and half the local police force, and Diane had been effectively neutralized, at least temporarily. As she finally departed, declining my offer of leftovers with a tight smile, I knew the battle wasn't over. But the dynamics had shifted significantly, and not in her favor. Rachel's assessment as we cleaned up the yard that evening was spot on. You've completely changed the narrative, James. She can't paint you as the neighborhood menace anymore, not after today. I nodded, thoughtful, but she'll find another angle. People like Diane don't give up power easily. Rachel laughed. Well, neither do people like you, apparently. I had no idea I married such a community activist. I grinned, gathering up empty plates. Neither did I. Turns out all you need to get me engaged in local politics is to threaten my barbecue rights. What I didn't say but was beginning to realize was that there was something deeply satisfying about standing up to a bully, especially when you could do it with kindness, community building, and really good food. The community's perception continued to evolve over the next 2 weeks. The County Gazette ran a small but positive piece about the fundraiser, including quotes from Sergeant Miller and, most surprisingly, Diane herself, who had managed to say all the right things to the reporter despite her obvious displeasure. The article featured a photo of officers enjoying plates of ribs alongside neighborhood children. With a caption highlighting the community police partnership, Rachel cut it out and framed it, hanging it in our living room as a reminder of what we'd accomplished. Neighbors who had previously avoided me now waved and stopped to chat, often mentioning how much they'd enjoyed the event. Several even asked for barbecue tips or invited us to their homes for dinner, social invitations that Rachel assured me had not been extended to anyone new in the neighborhood for years. Even more telling, 2 different families approached me about hosting similar fundraisers for other causes, seeing the success of my approach. The Martinez family wanted to raise money for their son's school band trip, while the Wilsons were involved with an animal rescue organization that needed support. I offered advice and assistance for both, happy to see the community spirit spreading beyond my own efforts. But the most significant development came from Tom, who arrived at my door one evening looking both nervous and excited. "You need to see this," he said, handing me a folder once we were seated in my living room. He glanced around as if concerned about being overheard, despite the fact that we were alone in my house. "What I'm about to show you, it could cause some serious waves in the neighborhood." Inside was a stack of financial statements and meeting minutes from the HOA over the past 3 years. "I've been on the landscaping committee," Tom explained, his voice dropping even though it was just the 2 of us. "After your presentation at the meeting, I started looking more closely at how decisions were being made. There are irregularities." I flipped through the documents, my eyes widening as I began to understand what I was seeing. Diane had been steering contracts to her brother-in-law's company at inflated rates. Landscape maintenance that should have cost $5,000 was consistently billed at $8,000. With the extra presumably being kicked back in some form. Certain homeowners, primarily those who had opposed her in the past, had been fined at higher rates than others for similar violations. The Hendersons' unapproved paint color had cost them $500 in fines, while the Patels' similarly minor infraction had been settled for $100. Most damning of all, there was evidence that Diane had used HOA funds to renovate her personal deck, disguising it as a community improvement project, despite the fact that no community property existed anywhere near her home. A $5,700 expenditure for neighborhood beautification that coincided perfectly with the construction of her new backyard entertainment area. "This is serious," I said finally, looking up at Tom. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" He shook his head. "Just my wife. I wanted your advice first. You seem to know how to handle difficult situations." I considered the options carefully. "We need to approach this by the book. No personal vendettas, just accountability." After discussing it further, we agreed on a plan. Present the evidence to the other board members privately, then call for a special meeting of all homeowners to address the financial concerns. It was time to end Diane's reign, but it needed to be done properly, with due process and undeniable evidence. The HOA bylaws were about to work in our favor for a change. I couldn't help reflecting on the irony. What had begun as a dispute over barbecue smoke had led to the potential unraveling of years of financial mismanagement. Sometimes the smallest sparks ignite the largest changes. We spent the next few days carefully compiling and organizing the evidence, making copies for each board member. Tom, as a committee member, arranged private meetings with the other 4 board members, strategically approaching them one by one to prevent Diane from catching wind of the investigation. The reactions were telling. Patricia, the secretary, had apparently harbored suspicions for years, but felt powerless to act alone. Richard, the treasurer, seemed genuinely shocked. He had signed off on financial statements but claimed he hadn't been given full access to the underlying documentation. The other 2 members, Martin and Elaine, were initially defensive but became increasingly concerned as Tom walked them through the evidence. By the end of the week, all 4 had agreed that a full audit was necessary, and they reluctantly accepted that it needed to happen without Diane's knowledge, at least initially. Patricia, as secretary, had the authority to call a special board meeting, which she did, carefully wording the agenda as budget review to avoid raising red flags. When Diane arrived at Patricia's house for what she thought was a routine meeting, she found herself facing 4 solemn board members and a stack of highlighted financial records. According to Tom, who recounted the confrontation to me later, Diane initially tried to bluster her way through, claiming misunderstandings and clerical errors. When that didn't work, she shifted to accusing Tom of conducting a witch hunt inspired by me. But the evidence was too clear, the pattern too consistent to be dismissed. The board voted unanimously to suspend Diane pending a full investigation and to call a special meeting of all homeowners to address the findings. Diane had stormed out, threatening legal action against each of them personally, a threat that only reinforced the impression that she had something significant to hide. The special meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening. Word had spread quickly throughout the neighborhood, and the community center was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. The 4 non-Diane board members sat at the front table, looking solemn. Diane's chair remained conspicuously empty. After reviewing the evidence Tom and I had compiled, the board had confronted Diane privately, giving her the opportunity to respond before bringing the matter to the community. According to Patricia, who now called the meeting to order, Diane had initially tried to dismiss the allegations as misunderstandings before becoming defensive and finally storming out when pressed for explanations about specific transactions. Due to the serious nature of the financial discrepancies identified, Patricia announced to the hush room, "The board has temporarily suspended Ms. Wheeler from her position as president, pending a full audit and legal review. Tonight, we will present our preliminary findings to the community and outline the steps being taken to address these issues." As Patricia began detailing the evidence, a commotion at the door drew everyone's attention. Diane pushed her way into the room, followed by a flustered-looking man in an ill-fitting suit who I later learned was her cousin, a real estate attorney from the next county over. "This meeting is unauthorized," Diane announced loudly. "As president of this association, I did not approve it, and I demand that it be adjourned immediately." Patricia remained remarkably calm. "Ms. Wheeler, as you were informed, your authority has been temporarily suspended under Bylaw 4, Section 7, which provides for emergency action by a majority of the board in cases of suspected malfeasance. You are welcome to stay and provide your perspective when the floor is opened for discussion." I sat quietly, observing the scene unfold. Rachel squeezed my hand, whispering, "This is better than any reality TV show." I had to agree. The community drama had reached levels I couldn't have imagined when I first fired up my smoker those few months ago. Diane's face flushed dark red. "This is a witch hunt orchestrated by newcomers who don't respect our community standards." Her gaze fixed on me, sitting quietly in the 3rd row. "Mitchell has been undermining my authority since he arrived, all because he can't follow simple rules about his backyard cooking." A murmur ran through the crowd, and I braced myself for accusation, but the community's mood had shifted too significantly. Instead of support, Diane's outburst drew uncomfortable glances and a few head shakes. Tom stood up from his seat near the front. "This isn't about barbecue, Diane. It's about the $12,000 paid to your brother-in-law's company for landscaping work that should have cost half that amount. It's about the selective enforcement of rules against people who disagree with you. And it's about the $5,700 community improvement project that somehow only improved your personal property. He gestured to the documents being passed around. It's all right there in the HOA's own records. Diane's cousin attorney tried to interject with legal terminology about proper procedures and defamation concerns, but he was clearly out of his depth in the face of the documented evidence. The meeting continued with Diane growing increasingly isolated as neighbor after neighbor stood to share stories of intimidation, selective enforcement, and petty retribution over the years. Some had been reluctant to speak out before, fearing further targeting, but the collective courage was contagious. I remained silent throughout most of the proceedings, understanding that this needed to be the community reclaiming its governance, not a personal victory over Diane. Finally, when Patricia called for a vote on whether to proceed with a full audit and potential legal action to recover misused funds, Diane and her cousin slipped out the side door before the nearly unanimous yes vote was completed.